of these bright yellow bubbles, the last one we're going to talk about is self-evaluation, also known as self-competence or self-esteem. So by self-evaluation, this is really not when we're worried about the external pressure of who we are and our external social reputation, but it's more about the distance between our true self and our ideal self and how we evaluate how we're doing. So if you think back to our self-concept and how that's who we are, and then one of our possible selves was our ideal self, and that's who we want to be, those might overlap. We might be slowly becoming who we want to be, or they might be pretty far apart. And the disparity between these two ideas, who you really are right now and who you want to be, if they're really far apart, we may feel more negatively about ourselves. We might evaluate ourselves in a more negative way, and we might have a lower self-esteem or lower self-confidence. If our ideal self and our who we are right now are starting, if we're working towards it and we can feel our goals getting closer, or if we're even starting to overlap a bit, we might evaluate that very positively and we might have higher self-esteem or feel very confident about ourselves. So congruence is the idea that these two circles would overlap. Disparity is the idea that they're very far apart. And self-acceptance is the idea that you're happy with who you are. You're happy with what's in your self-concept. So for instance, here I had the little bubbles. I had the idea perhaps someone is alone and they don't have a lot of friends, but they desire a lot of friends. There's going to be a disparity between those two bubbles, and this is going to make them feel more negative about themselves and feel less competent because they're not who they want to be. Now keep in mind, when we're building these different bubbles, it's all subjective. What you put in your self-concept and what you put in your ideal self is going to be individually unique. And so because of that, our self-evaluation is going to be constructed in a way that's very personal. We find that if there is something that's very important to your self-concept, it's going to weigh more on your self-evaluation or self-esteem. If it's something that's not part of your self-concept or not part of your ideal self, it's not going to influence your self-esteem. Let's say you try to go skateboarding. You're curious to see how you'll do, but you actually do not have a good time and you really struggle with it. Now, if you always had in your ideal self that you wanted to become a skateboarder, that might be more crushing to you. Versus if skateboarding is not something that ever crushed your ideal self, it's something you've never really considered seriously, it's probably not going to hurt your feelings. If you got a draft of an essay back and it was heavily marked up with lots of criticism, and you always wanted to be a very strong writer, and you had in your ideal self and even had in your self-concept that you're a strong writer, you might take that a lot more personally and it might hurt you a lot more. Versus if you know that you're struggling with it and you've accepted yourself as a learning writer and a developing writer, it might not hurt your self-esteem because your self-concept is that you are not trying to be a perfect writer, you're starting to develop. And so that's the idea that you're going to respond to criticism a little bit better. So the same real behaviors will have different outcomes based on what we have in our self-concept and what we have in our ideal self. For instance, let's say somebody said that you are very quiet and very stingy with your money. Well, if you have in your ideal self that you try to be very quiet and very reserved with your money, you might actually take that as a compliment. Versus if you have in your ideal self that you're going to be very generous and share money all the time, and you also want to be very loud and outgoing and forceful, those are going to come across as insults and you're not going to like them. We also know that in terms of the growth versus fixed mindset, that if something is in your ideal self and you struggle with it, you're more likely to go into a fixed mindset. You're more likely to say, I'm never going to get this, and panic over it. Versus if something is not in your ideal self, you're more likely to have a growth mindset, and you're more likely to say, oh, I can keep trying on this. So it's the idea, let's say you're really good at math problems, and somebody gave you a few impossible math problems, and you didn't realize they're impossible, and you just couldn't solve them. And you always wanted to be really good at math, that's in your ideal self that you're good at math. Well, then what happens is you might start to have learned helplessness and give up on the math problems and quit them very easily. Versus if you consider that you don't really consider yourself a really strong math person, but you enjoy math, and it's not in your ideal self that you have to be good at math, you're just going to try your best, you won't learn to learn helplessness as quickly, and you'll keep trying no matter what. So because of this, we find that the way we form our self-evaluations can be very different based on what we have in our self-concept and based on what we have in our ideal self. Now, in addition to how we evaluate and being different, we know there's lots of variability in terms of our self-esteem and self-confidence and self-evaluation. Some individuals have a very stable and high self-esteem. So it's always at high tide, if you will. And this is the idea that they feel confident, they feel good about themselves. Even if there is disparity between who they want to be someday, they have this idea that they can make steps towards it or they can grow towards it, and they're not too worried about it. They feel they're going in the right direction. We also have people that have stable and low self-esteem. This is the idea that they're very overwhelmed by the disparity between their ideal self and their self-concept. They're at low tide all the time, and they're really struggling, and they don't like what's in their self-concept. They're unhappy with it, and they want to change. Then we have individuals who have a highly changeable self-esteem. These are individuals who fluctuate like the tides. Twice a day they feel very high about themselves, and twice a day they feel very low about themselves. This is the most problematic type of self-esteem, this highly changeable self-esteem. They're more really emotionally reactive to the components of their day. Now, we all have those days where something really good happens or something really bad happens at the same time, and we feel our emotions fluctuate. But your emotions fluctuating is not the same as your evaluation of yourself fluctuating. This is the idea that you feel like you are good, and now you feel like you are awful, and now you feel like you are good again. And so not an evaluation of events, but an evaluation of you changing drastically is tied with more mental health distress and more concern and more negative developmental outcomes. So what can we do about this? Well, there's lots of different ways we can protect our self-esteem. And Edward E. Jones is a social psychologist who proposed a few of these ideas. All of these will seek to address or prevent the disparity between our true self or our self-concept and our ideal self. So we're going to talk about reframing first. Reframing is when you reevaluate what needs to be in your ideal self. You think, well, do I really need those goals? This happens if you set goals that are a little bit too unrealistic and a little bit too high. You adjust them. So you change what's in the ideal self so that it better matches your self-concept. This allows us to view our self-concept more positively. It can move us towards more self-acceptance and more self-actualization. This is the idea perhaps when you were younger you wanted a mansion with a butler and a limousine, and now you're realizing, hey, as long as I can afford a house and I have the energy to mop it myself and just a regular car that gets me to work, I'm cool with that. And so it's the idea that you're adjusting some of those really idealistic components of your ideal self and you're making them more realistic. So this reframing can make us feel more happy with what we have, and we don't have to dream so big. Reframing could also be where you start to reframe what's in your self-concept. Maybe you've been underestimating what you've been having. Maybe you haven't been appreciating who you've been or what you've had. So reframing that can also reduce the disparity and bring those two bubbles together. Then we have the complexity. We know that individuals can vary in how broad or how focused their self-concept can be. And we find that having a more complex self-concept can be a buffer and can be adaptive when we go through some negative experiences. Think about the fact that we have lots of possible selves and we have multiple ought and ideal selves. If you have some ideal selves that are just not obtainable, but other ideal selves are, that can help ease the pressure you're putting on yourself. In addition, if we think just about the self-concept, if you have a very basic self-concept, let's say you feel like you're someone's spouse, you're someone's romantic partner, and that's completely who you are. You don't know who you are outside of that relationship. If that relationship were to end, you are going to face a lot of depression, you're going to face a lot of emotional distress, because now you might be experiencing identity deficit and not know who you are and not have a sense of yourself anymore. Versus if you're in a relationship with someone, but you're also maintaining other healthy relationships with your family, you're also pursuing a career or lots of hobbies, and you have some pets that you love, and that relationship ends, it's still going to be emotionally distressing, but perhaps less so because you have a stronger sense of who you are outside of the relationship, and you can fall back on your other attributes. You won't experience that identity deficit to the same degree. So having a more complex self-concept and having multiple possible ideal selves is beneficial for us because you have more roles and more avenues and more doors that you can rely on. Now, in terms of the other mechanisms, one that we find is not so adaptive is failure avoidance. Failure avoidance is the idea that you are so worried that you're going to receive confirmation that you are not congruent with your ideal self. You are so worried about receiving confirmation that you are where you are right now is different and distant from your ideal self that you don't want to try. You avoid challenges. You avoid any circumstances that are going to confirm you're not who you dream you are. So failure avoidance is the idea that you avoid anything that has a chance of failure. You don't want to go and ask people out on a date because you're scared they're going to shoot you down. Or you back out of your first date with someone in case it doesn't go well. You don't want to be dumped. This is the idea that you don't take hard courses in university because you don't want a problematic grade on your transcript. Or that you don't sign up to run a 10K because you don't think you can finish it. That you're so scared of failure that it's not that you're failing the behavior, it's that if you fail the behavior, you take that right back to your self-concept and you feel you are a failure. And all of a sudden failure goes into your self-concept and you're so worried about that. So this is maladaptive for many of the reasons you can imagine. This person's not allowing themselves to grow. They're very much going to have that fixed mindset where they feel if they struggle once, they'll always struggle, they have to give up. And they just don't want to have the confirmation of that failure because then they have to evaluate themselves more negatively and they're not ready to accept that they may not be their ideal self. They're not ready, they're not in that place of self-acceptance yet. Then we have a second mechanism, which is called self-handicapping. This is similar to failure avoidance, only you actually go through the motion, but you don't try your best. This is the idea you might go out on a first date, but you intentionally act like a jerk, because then when it doesn't go well, you can be like, yeah, I wasn't trying, I was being a jerk, not that they didn't like me. You don't want to find out that they didn't like you for who you really are, so you put on a mask and you pretend. And this is the idea that if you're really worried about an exam and you're so scared you're going to fail, somebody might get really inebriated on substances, so when they fail the test, it wasn't their true self failing, or they didn't fail even though they tried their best. They failed even though they were high or stoned or what have you. So then it's not going to attack their self-esteem. And this self-handicapping, also called self-sabotaging, is the idea that they're just a clown. They're just joking around and it's not them actually being serious. They're so scared about being serious and failing that they'd rather just joke and make a joke out of everything so that they don't have to worry and put their self-esteem on the line. And so this is the idea that they, again, are never allowing for that test to see how far away that disparity truly is. They're not allowing a pure measurement of that, so they don't have to evaluate themselves. And the last one, a little bit different here. This one is called defensive pessimism. And this is the idea that you start to perceive your self-concept in a more negative way than is real. You have a real pessimistic view of who you are. And it's the idea that your self-concept is actually closer to your ideal self than you think, but you pretend they're really far apart. So when they're a little bit closer, you feel good about it. So this is when you prepare for the worst, hope for the best. This is the idea you expect to fail. So even if you're really competent in something, even if you're really strong, you imagine that you're going to fail. And you constantly get yourself worked up, you imagine the absolute worst. This can be adaptive in some avenues. In fact, it allows people to focus their energy. They over-prepare for situations. If you think you're going to fail a math test, you might over-prepare for the math test and then you actually do better. Or if you think you're going to fail at a weightlifting competition, you might over-prepare for it. And what actually happens is people who engage in defensive pessimism tend to be more successful because they're so prepared for the worst case scenario. They tend to put more work into it and they tend to benefit. But it doesn't stay long. Although they really downplay their self-concept and say that it's really far away from their ideal self, when they get confirmation they actually did okay and there's a little bit of overlap there, it's only temporary. Then they say, well, next time I'll fail. And then they get confirmation again and they say, well, next time I'll fail. And they never really benefit from that. They still don't feel good about themselves. In addition, this has a tendency to really annoy people in one's social circle. It's the idea that can really gripe on people to hear someone who's really skilled say that they're not. And other people are going through their own stuff. They may not be as strong as you. When you say you're not strong, they really feel bad about themselves. And so it's not adaptive 100%, but it is tied to more success.